Welcome to 775 Alive. I'm Scott Gavorski,
And I'm Crystal Newton.
and we're sort of coming to you in a different format today. One of the things we've chatted about here about living in the 775 out here in rural Nevada is distances are often overwhelming, right? So, Elko, where I am, are you in your office in Winnemucca there, Crystal?
I am in my office in Winnemucca. It is 5 o'clock. Just got off work. I don't have time to drive 2 hours to come see you, even though I'd love to.
Yeah, and that's a key point. We're about 2 hours apart, right? So we also wanted to do this a little bit to test our capabilities because one of the things we're looking forward to doing here in 775 Alive is getting some guests in, right? So you can look at something besides my ugly mug, right? I'm assuming most of you don't have a problem looking at my co-host, right? I'm the problem here. But it,
Thanks.
but it's also Crystal and I have been traveling quite a bit here over the last weekend because we were both recently here in Carson City, right, for
That's
the
right.
Nevada Republican State Central Committee meeting, right? We get together
Yes.
quarterly. Delegations from all the counties get together and discuss where the party's going.
Yeah, Scott went in for the whole gambit. He spent 2 whole days
Hmm.
talking endless agenda points, and I came in for the last 2 hours, so I had it easy. Then I got to go to the Lincoln Day dinner and have a great time. So,
Right.
Scott, thank you so much for covering all that.
Oh, hey, no problem. I had to
Well,
be
it's
there
kind of
anyway. I
interesting.
serve on I serve on some study groups for the state rural caucus and got there. But
Yeah.
it's sort of interesting. So both of us have been traveling. I'm roughly 5 hours from Carson City, right? Winnemucca is a little closer, not
Mhm.
much, right? So, but one of the interesting things that happened, of course, the main meeting, and when you came into town was Saturday, April 5th. So that's where we had all the protests, the hands-off protest day, right?
I know. I drove in late just so I could avoid all the complicated issues of the day. And what did I do? I drove right through a Democratic protest.
Yeah.
So I had
And
this interesting sort of juxtaposition of events where I was driving through angry Democratic protesters to get to a Republican state meeting.
right.
So
Um,
interesting juxtaposition for me.
well, yeah, and it was interesting. I will point out they weren't actually we were on the south side of Carson City, which of course most of you, if you're in the state of Nevada, know that Carson City is the state capital. Most of the protests were up near the state legislature,
Yeah.
which is sort of right downtown Carson City, right there.
Yeah.
So but it's sort of interesting because it sparked some discussion here. I think between you and I about what is actually going on, these tensions that we're
Yeah.
seeing here. And actually, you got about what 10 seconds of footage when you were driving.
I did. I shot 10 seconds. I was a little fearful of filming them. I wasn't sure if they were going to come attack my car or not, but I got 10 seconds off to you because I just wanted to prove it. Like, see, it's real.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and watch that real quick here.
This is awesome.
Um,
Yeah. So what's interesting to me in that footage is it was more like 2 miles of that, but a question I wanted to pose to you, Scott, it was something I was thinking about last night. Something struck me about that protest, and we're both really big fans of the Constitution. I personally think it's one of the best documents ever written, and the First Amendment in particular, I'm a big fan of. And we all have a right to protest, and we have a right to assemble.
mhm.
When I saw this crowd, I got to thinking because all the signs were the same size, all the stenciling was the same size. It was very clear that somebody had organized and brought all the supplies and had
Mhm.
everything prepped for people. My question to you, Scott, and probably to people in America at large is protesting and being compensated for it really a direct reflection of what the First Amendment intended? Because up until now, you've had people decide for themselves, I don't like what's going on. And they come out and they protest. They have different size signs. Some people will wear hats. Some people wear t shirts. Some people just wear plain clothes. But what struck me was this was almost a branded protest. And I
Mhm.
wondered if we're starting to cross a constitutional line with these paid protests and being supplied and almost,
Mhm.
it's almost more like a campaign event if you look at it from an entity and a structure point of view. And I know I'm just dropping this on you in the middle of a podcast, but it did. I really was considering it because something really rubbed me wrong with the way that protest was going, you know?
Well, you raise an interesting question. Although I think one of the things to bear in mind, first of all, it is a campaign, right? And
Hmm.
that's not derogatory, right? I mean,
No,
most types of organized protests when they advertise it ahead of time, and even though we were in Carson City, those of us in the Elko delegation were following the news back here from Elko when we had a small one going from. I don't know if you guys even had one in Winnemucca. I
I
don't.
don't know either. I was in Carson City,
City.
obviously, but I was surprised to hear there was one in Elko.
Yeah, I mean it was relatively small.
Hmm.
But I think to get back to your question, I think there's two components, right? Organization in and of itself is not necessarily a sign of sort of a nefarious being paid, right? So, for instance, organization of protest and the way that you approach it, I would actually argue goes back to the beginning. I mean, a lot of the protests in the 1760s against the Stamp Act and all this in the U.S., a lot of that, well, what was then the 13 colonies, a lot of it's being organized through these groups that Jefferson and others set up, these corresponding societies. So they're
Okay.
sharing slogans and they're sharing ideas and they're sharing approaches and arguments here during these protests. Um, but even if we look at protest, and I have to, I'll say up front, I'm sort of skeptical at how effective protests are at affecting change, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that the protests that do affect change tend to be these that are sustained for a very long period of time and really address big issues, right?
Yeah.
And the preeminent example here is, of course, the protest against discrimination and securing African American civil rights back in the 60s, Martin Luther King and all that. And in those protests, a lot of them were very, very organized, right?
Yeah.
You saw standard slogans. There was a very clear discussion for groups like the Freedom Riders who go south. Into places like Mississippi to fight for African American voting rights. You know, they're encouraged to dress in a certain way to make themselves
Yeah.
not look like a radical or something. They're being taught how to approach or what happens if police approach them, how to act, so on and so forth. So
Hmm.
all that I don't think is necessarily a problematic um,
No.
issue, right?
Where I felt like it really crossed the line is the minute you start to compensate people, it starts to border on commercial activity. And
Hmm.
that's why I really wondered if, people are being paid to show up, are they really just defending their civil rights or are they contractors? And in
Oh,
one case it is constitutional right, in the other case it's a campaign event.
well, I think an interesting way of thinking about this is how do you feel about lobbyists? I mean, also in the First Amendment, your right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Does
Touche,
that
sir. Touche. Good
right?
example.
Does the lobbyist right? I mean, granted, we ideally we wouldn't live in a world that would need lobbyists, but there you go. Yeah,
No.
it's a difficult issue,
Yeah.
and I think this is something that that's probably we're going to start exploring more and more and more. These so-called, well, I think the slang term is these not grassroots movements, but astroturf movements. This
Mr. Turf,
implication that,
I like it.
right, these implications that it's somehow artificial and corporately sponsored and this type of stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a growing dynamic. Now, that being said, one of the things that struck me about these protests, and this really goes back to when I was talking about earlier that I don't really think protests are effective, um, is just looking at the Elko one. And again, we probably only had 100 people, and I'm sure if I'd been there, I probably would have known half of them. Not that we're enemies or anything. We just happen to live in the same community, and that's
Right.
fine.
Yeah.
But what got me about these protests is you look in these signs, and there really is nothing that seems to be a unifying theme, right?
Hmm.
This thing is hands off my Social Security. This one is hands off the VA. Okay, it's a hands off
Yeah.
protest. The other one's no oligarchs, which is like, where's the hands off come into this? The other
Yeah.
is, Trump is a traitor. I mean, this is one of the problems I think when you get into these types of protests where it really is just more of protesting Trump in various ways, as opposed
Yeah.
to any sort of coherent long term strategy
I
to affect
almost want to
change.
I almost want to coin a new term for these types of protests. I want to call them platypus protests because they're a mix of different parts that don't quite belong. It's very, you can tell just looking at it, you're like, something, this is a very strange animal that I'm looking at, and it doesn't quite fit. And I always go back to the Constitution. I'm just like, I don't think that's the constitutional interpretation of protests. We're really starting to get off the beaten path with that. And I wonder if the Supreme Court at some point might start to challenge just how much money are these protesters getting paid, and when do you cross that commercialization line.
Yeah.
But
Well, and
anyhow, just food for thought. It
no,
just occurred to me. I've been thinking about it this last week since that meeting.
right. No, no, and I think this is, I mean, this is uh, a very interesting issue because we're coming off this extended period here of these protests. And we're also going to hear about, because one of the things, of course, today we're recording this on April 9th, and President Trump announced earlier that he's backing off the tariffs for these 75 countries who have already approached us to negotiate the reciprocal tariffs, while he's upping it on
Yes.
China, which is another
Yeah.
story. And we just recently did this tariff issue, or the tariff episode, where we were discussing tariffs as a negotiating strategy, and that seems to be borne out. But I think one of the things we're going to see here over the next week is this argument that somehow the protesting and the complaints about the tariffs is what got the Trump administration to back down, which then legitimates this approach. Um,
Of
but
course. Well, I mean, if I were the Democratic Party, I'd try to frame it that way as well.
right,
You know.
but it gets into an interesting question is that uh, I don't see the Supreme Court making in any way, shape, or form any ruling that says, okay, if somehow you're not aimed at a particular goal, you can't be part of this protest, right? And
No,
it's always. Can I tell you a funny story about that?
I would
Right?
love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
About the Supreme Court?
No, it's not about the Supreme Court.
Okay.
It's
I was
about
like,
this
are there
question.
funny stories about the Supreme Court? They're very
Well, I'm
serious,
sure I'm sure there's plenty of them. But no, most of you probably know I grew up in Atlanta, and I remember back in the '80s when uh, the Last Temptation of Christ movie came out, and of course Atlanta's right smack dab in the middle of the Bible Belt. So there were protests against the movie, which a lot of people found sacrilegious for various reasons. So I go down there. Of course, I was still in high school at this time. I go down there to view the protest, and I show up at the one cinema in Atlanta, right? At that time's already 2 million people, and there's only one cinema playing this movie because they're so worried about the
Oh,
protest. And there's a couple hundred people out there protesting, and the police are talking to this guy. There's two or three police officers talking to this guy, and the reason they're talking to him is that his protest sign reads "Jimmy the Greek for President." Who is the guy that used to do the betting odds well, he's on 60 Minutes, but Wide World of Sports or whatever, one of the sports shows, right? So this guy was just out here doing something that was totally unconnected, and the police were like, "What are you doing here?" Right? um, but again, that's not. I don't see the Supreme Court doing that. Now, the question of money in protest, uh, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure we've solved the lobbyist issue through the
all
Supreme
right.
Court.
You,
Um,
you know, I always tend to skip over points. I mean, obviously, for something to reach the Supreme Court, they would have to be addressing a lawsuit that got introduced at a lower level, and that may be a political strategy down the road. But I certainly, if I'm starting to think about it, there's probably going to be some Republican strategists that might start considering drafting a lawsuit and see how the Supreme Court looks
mhm,
at that, because I'm really bothered by it. I mean, the fact that people are getting paid, the materials are being supported, it's being organized for them. There's nothing the individual citizen is really doing on their own, which is what the amendment is for, is to protect your individual rights.
mhm.
So I see there's a maybe, anyways, but
Well,
interesting thing to think about. Like, I'm really
yes.
not okay with protesters getting paid. It doesn't make sense with the spirit of the law.
All right. Well, and there's always spirit and letter.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm really not sure. I'm struggling with seeing how they can click into this because I'm almost sure if you would have looked, um, it would not surprise me that some of the organizations, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the 1960s, they had paid staff who were probably helping organize.
Yeah.
I don't really think that's surprising. You do bring up an interesting question where we have a gig economy emerging and protesting becomes a gig, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and that also raises a lot of questions about, oh, response to police. Is there a fear potentially that a quote unquote professional protester might be more willing to stand their ground or more willing to challenge the police and see an uptick in violence resulting from that as these situations intensify? I think it's an important
Yeah.
question. I'm just not
It
really
is.
sure. The fact that some group is supplying the posters and stencils and they're all using these standardized slogans. I'm pretty sure. Well, actually, this is actually a good example to think about if we um, and I'll point out neither one of us are lawyers, nor do we play one on podcast. Right, legal disclaimer there. But where a lot of this legal stuff might actually be embedded is with unions and strikes.
Oh, yeah, that was something I had considered when I was thinking this question through was okay, this looks like union, the way a union is organized. So I was like, that's legal. So there's a lot of different ways to sort of look at that
Right.
legally. And it's fun to think about more than anything. And it's a good exercise to go through because it strengthens your understanding of the Constitution and the law. It's always fun. And
Right.
we had 3 or 4 customers come into the office. They rarely come to the office. We sell and assemble pivots. Generally, they're calling us. But we had some customers come in and they're always into politics. I love farmers. They always have an opinion on something. And lately, I've gotten into this habit of asking them, is this the worst time in the world? And the reason why is because I'm seeing things like this protest, where these protesters genuinely think the end of the world is near. And so I like to have a sense of humor about things and explore things. So I've just been asking people this last week, do you think this is the worst time that human beings have ever gone through? And I get laughed at every time by conservatives, and they go, nope. But I ask a Democrat the same question, and they are absolutely 100% convinced that this is the end of times. And so it's an interesting time to think, and it really is important to get down to the legal basis of what's going on so that we all
Hmm.
have common ground for where we can speak from.
Right. Right. And of course you and I Saturday night after the dinner we got talking with a mutual friend of ours over there. Staff's trying to
Yes.
clean up and get us out, and there we are rambling on about stuff.
Yes.
And you know,
They kicked us out,
they
actually.
kicked us out.
They did. The waiter
Right.
was like, some of us would like to go home. And we're like, oh, it's okay.
Sorry.
We got you.
Um,
We're going.
but in this conversation, the friend we were talking with, I don't want to mention his name because we haven't really
No.
talked to him about this, but he does say
Important
something
part is
really interesting when he was saying he doesn't think now is the worst time he'd gone through, but he actually thought the last
we're
four
from
years
three
were really
different.
bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Something I loved about us was we sat down and the 3 of us realized that we're from 3 different generations. And it
Hmm.
was really interesting to contemplate this question.
Right, and I think that's part of help structure a lot of the dynamic we're seeing now, right? Like I said, this friend was saying he thought the last 4 years were bad, but it's better now, which tells me that if you think it's the end of the world, it's probably not because it's going to get better, right? Uh, the world continues to turn, but we also had a conversation.
You and
We
I
also
have
had
gone back and forth quite a bit on this, actually.
Right. And
Yep.
well, and it is generational and it's subjective, right? These perceptions are subjective. So, me growing up in basically the Rust Belt as a young boy and watching sort of the Carter recession and the first stretch of these manufacturing establishments, still in Ohio, so they were all going across the border to Canada. And the devastation that wreaked on the communities, that felt like the end of the world, right?
Mhm.
This mutual friend who's a generation older than us, he didn't see that period as particularly damaging because he was already an adult and he was actually already working, well, let's just say tied to the defense industry. And so what
Mhm.
he thought was sort of the closing stage of his sort of when his world fell apart was after the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, right? When a
Yeah.
lot of defense industry sort of spooled down. Now, for the rest of us who were cheering the fall of the Berlin Wall, right, and the fall of Soviet communism, this was a very positive time. And I think you're going to see some of that with these protests. Is now you have, the anti-Trump side, the Democratic side, that thinks this is the worst of all possible times, and you have the other side saying this is the best of times, if we can, invoke Charles Dickens here. But on the other hand, if you would have looked 2 years ago, probably would have just been reverse, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the
Exactly.
reasons I'm always suspicious of this. Oh, it's the worst time ever type of arguments.
Yeah. But it is important to sort of dissect it because we have a big divide in our country between people that believe that and people that don't. And at the end of the day, whether one side is right or not, we still have to find a way to bridge that divide. And I
Hmm.
know you and I spend a ton of time trying to construct a narrative that could bring both sides in because ultimately we're just talking about narratives. The
Hmm.
Republican side has a narrative, the Democratic side has a narrative. You're siloed no matter what side you're on. So to get a center, we actually have to come up with a third narrative that both sides can kind of step into, maybe not permanently, but as a guest, so they can say hi to each other and maybe
Yeah.
won't devolve into civil war. And it's a very challenging thing to come up with a narrative, but this week I was thinking about this very much. I was very much stimulated by seeing that protest. And what had occurred to me, there is one line of dialogue that I thought was powerful. So what had occurred to me was we have the greatest constitution, in my opinion. We have the greatest legal document that governs our country. And we have these wonderful rights. And one of those rights is the right to protest. And
Hmm.
in order to have all these rights and to execute them, we actually have to have a fairly functioning country in order
Mm.
for a protest to even occur. So to me, the fact that they are protesting is evidence that the country is actually running fairly well.
Hmm.
You know, they're exercising the freedoms that they're afraid of losing. And so by definition, the fact that they're protesting shows that the country's doing pretty darn good. There's plenty of places you cannot protest in the world.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and one
you're
could
going to
be
go to a
cynical in
den
saying
somewhere.
there were even here, when we had the George Floyd protests going on, and at the same time we have the CDC and the National Institutes of Health saying, okay, any other types of protests are not valid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2020. So there's a lot here. Can I go back to this narrative issue?
Sure.
Because there's
It is
something
the
there's
issue.
yeah, there's something else that's interesting about the narrative. This was in a conversation we were having a couple days ago, where you brought up the point that part of the problem with narratives is narratives need a theme, they need a direction, and part of that
Mm-hmm.
direction is convincing people the world is ending,
Yeah.
right? And one of the things I think we have, and I'd like maybe sometime I got to get some more data, but those of you know I'm sort of a numbers wonk now, looking at like registration numbers for political parties and stuff. But one of the things that's been going on in the last 30, 40 years is actually, and this is actually another sign of a healthy country. We've been divided sort of 50-50 politically,
Yeah.
right? The problem we're having such contested elections is there's no clear shift one way or the other, right, nationally. And so I think that's led a lot of people who are into the political narrative game that the way you win is sort of to really rile up a base of people who are going to vote anyway, make sure they get out to push you over that 50% plus one. And the way you do that is a lot of these, this is the worst of all possible times narratives. We need to fight now. Um, and that has a huge disadvantage, and not only does it up a lot of the political tension, right?
Yeah.
But it does ignore this center you were just talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? These
And
people. Go ahead.
yeah, and it's a short-lived strategy because something I know as a business person is if you run if you run your product really hot and fast with your consumer burns out on the product. So
Hmm.
strategically, I'm not too worried about the Democratic strategy just because these guys are running too hot and too emotional. They're going to burn out super quick.
Hmm.
It's not the greatest of strategies.
Well, and I'll point out it's not just a Democratic issue, right? We're
Well,
also
the
we're
sky
also
is falling narrative. It's like you can only say the sky is falling so many times before people are like, well,
right.
the sky isn't falling. You know what I
But
mean?
yeah, but I think we saw a lot of that on the Republican side as well, right? Um, it sort of worked. It got the election, but one of the things I think we're seeing is there's a push among some segments, even here, about the Republican county parties and local parties and activist groups to keep pushing that narrative, that anger here. And we're seeing it in some of the commentary
Yeah.
about Doge. We're seeing it in some of the commentary about, in the Doge thing, right? A lot of people are saying, this isn't about government efficiency. We should be finding people and putting them in jail. And again, this goes back to that distinction between fraud and waste. Um,
Yeah.
that's really important. So I'm thinking it's an across the board issue, and unfortunately, it's an issue uh, that in the long term probably does more disservice than it does service, right?
Yeah.
And you're right, it's
Uh,
short
you
term.
Yeah, there's a short term problem. And you brought up an excellent point that I really hadn't considered, which was the boomers. This is really a Democratic strategy that is focused on the boomer generation just because
Hmm.
they're already in the habit of protesting. It's something they, dare I say, like to do. It's
Hmm.
almost like a hobby for them. And I thought that was a really insightful point that you made, was that they are focused on the boomers, and those are the people that are coming out, and they may be coming out more of a social event for them than an actual expression of constitutional rights.
Well, yeah, and my comment on saying that, I think that's right because, well, let me back up a bit. I do think that a lot of this triggers within this baby boom generation, or at least a segment of this baby boom generation, sort of a memory of the halcyon days of the late 60s, early 70s, right? When
Uh-huh.
these social protests appeared to work. And again, 100% they worked in shifting public opinion towards African American civil rights. I don't think there's any question about that whatsoever. But I do
Definitely
think
civil rights glory. Yeah.
right. But I do think they were less successful in a lot of the other issues, right? That long term change wasn't really achieved, and I would argue it's still an open question. For instance, if these protests turned against or turned the population against the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah.
That's an important question. It's getting us a little farther off ground, but I do think that part of what's going on is that this model is one that's been deeply embedded here within this culture held by the baby boomers. And I think what you're seeing is, I don't want to say a last gasp, but it is close to it, right?
Yeah.
Donald Trump's going to be our last baby boomer president, right? No
Oh,
doubt about
wow.
that, right?
Yeah.
We just don't we don't have we don't there's no other baby boomer that's going to get it, right? I'm sorry, Bernie Sanders isn't going to get elected. Um, so I think what you're seeing, right, is that this sort of organized protest culture really harkens back to previous stuff. And I'm not saying young people don't protest. There's a lot of young people out at these events, right? No doubt about it. Of course, one could argue, are they, are they protesters, or are they sort of, W4 gig employees for some other organization? I don't want to
Trying to
question
get
anybody's motive, right?
they're trying to get social media glory. They're showing up to get that one shot, they can get posted and get all the likes. That's what they're showing up for. It's kind of interesting because the young ones are showing up for the social media posts that they're going to get, and the boomers are showing up for this nostalgic social thing. And it's almost like nobody at the protest is actually there for the actual protests. It's
Well,
kind
I,
of
I mean,
interesting to watch this play out. I'm just, what are we doing here?
yeah,
You know?
and I'll point out that people can have multiple reasons for doing something, and I mean, I'd really go on record as saying I think that 85, 90, 95% of the protesters are legitimately outraged about whatever issue they're
You think?
protesting. I think that's legitimate, right?
Okay.
Um, what I don't, what I do question though, is how effective this looks like in terms of strategy, in the long
Oh,
term. And
yeah.
I think it's a long term thing, and I think it again. Well, boycotts are another good example. Part of the interesting thing about the whole Bud Light kerfuffle a couple of years ago is that
Oh,
that boycott
no.
actually worked, right?
He did. He
Boycotts
did.
generally do not work, right? Because the
Yeah.
people usually boycotting a product probably weren't the target market for the product to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, this is a
And it
uh,
didn't work just once. It, like, Robbie Starbuck has gone from corporation to corporation to corporation, and they fold even before he gets to their front door. So it is interesting that it's gone from being almost ineffective to Robbie Starbuck has almost figured out how to make a profession out of it, like
right.
professional boycotting. Again, money being fed into something that usually didn't get paid for.
Right.
Interesting times.
Well, and there's an argument also when we talk about this that this is circulated for years, that a lot of these discrimination lawsuits against companies really aren't generated by actual grievances as much as a way that these sort of function as a corporate shakedown,
Yeah.
right? That you file a lawsuit that the company probably could win if it went to court, but the public embarrassment is what they want to avoid, so they'll go ahead and settle out of court.
Yeah.
Again, not saying that's legitimate. It does that type of strategy. Um, it does unfortunately sort of um, um, it forces legitimate grievances into the background, and that's one of the problems that I think if we're talking about the right to, and remember, it's not a right to protest in the Constitution; it's a right to assembly and petition the government for redress of grievances.
Yes.
Right?
Thank you for that.
Protesting,
Yes.
yeah, protesting combines those two, and speech, right? So three really. But it's something that I think in many ways um, has become a technique that is somehow probably not the best technique in a lot of cases. There's probably better
Mhm.
ways to get stuff done. Um,
I really don't think this is an attempt to get anything done. Honestly, what I think is
mm,
happening with the Democratic Party is they have a very angry base that wants answers and they want action, and they really can't provide it because they don't have control of any of the bodies. So, the next thing that you can do as a party is organize protests for people to blow off steam, and it
hmm
gives them the illusion that something is getting done.
right.
But without those protests, these would be very angry people seething at home, and it's very toxic. So, this is more of a strategy to keep the Democratic Party from being completely rotten tomatoed, if that
hmm
makes any sense. So,
Well,
I see
yeah,
it as just a pressure relief valve to try to help them save face until they can get something done.
right. And I think that's a an accurate portrayal of some of the response. And I also think it's why we're not really seeing a strong response to these from the Trump administration, right?
Right?
I mean, part of the argument from the first term when the George Floyd riots were going on was this argument that Trump was trying to use the troops to clear Lafayette Square in Washington. Was it Lafayette Square in Washington D.C. And all this other stuff? But and that's starting to come up now. So you're starting to see that in some of the social media feeds here from these um,
Mm-hmm.
for some of these Democratic groups that are trying to stretch out these protests. I think that's a key difference, though, is that we're not seeing the violence, and this is kudos to the Democratic side, right? Particularly following up what we're seeing with some of the anti-Tesla stuff. We have not seen violence with these, and I don't expect to see violence with these protests. Not if they want to keep them
Mm-hmm.
legitimate, and I think that's a key dynamic, right? Once it
Yeah.
crosses over into that violence thing, then we're having a different type of discussion, right?
Yeah.
Whoever initiates the violence, we're having a different type of discussion.
Yeah, that's domestic terrorism. And I think, well, that's
Mm,
Pam Bondi is looking at it that way, and it is open to interpretation. But I mean, basically, I don't drive a Tesla, and I try to put myself into the situation of a Tesla owner. And I, it sucks that you have to be afraid to park your car somewhere.
hmm
Um, that basically you're being terrorized in your everyday activities. The kind of pretty much fits the definition of domestic terrorism. And I am curious to see if they do prosecute a couple of these cases, if it will take the wind out of all of these occurrences. You know what I mean? Like,
hmm
if we see a prosecution, will this tactic completely diminish? And I mean, I know they have another one planned for what, April 20th or
April
19th.
19th. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
so I like, again, you're going to burn out your consumer. I call it consumer because politics, they're selling a product and people are consuming it. I just call it what it is. But, I mean, by April 20th, I mean, how long can you sustain the anger and the outrage? It just gets exhausting after a while, you know?
well, and again, remember this is a Democratic Party who I think has also been caught off guard by some of the elements within MAGA being able to sustain this type of rage and outrage for 4 years. I think a
Wasn't
lot
it
of them
rage and
thought
outrage?
I no, I think there is, and and again, just like I don't think that every Democratic protester is somehow cynical in this protest, right? A lot of them have legitimate issues, and that's perfectly fine. But I think there was a lot of misunderstanding on the Democratic side as well. If we look over the last 4 years of
Okay.
people who they thought this was because the term astroturf actually comes from the Democratic criticism of stuff like the Tea Party movement that this was
Mm-hmm.
created back around 2010, that this was created out of nothing. There's no real grievances there. It's just a political tactic, right?
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of reading on the MAGA movement in that way as well.
Okay. Well, and it is hard to put yourself in the shoes of the other side. And I told you this, and I believe I also told my mom this, but what was interesting, another thing that came out of driving through that protest was I remember how big the MAGA and Trump rallies were. And I'm not saying there were protests, those rallies were huge and they were really fun. And everyone was having a great time. And we were enthusiastic and waving flags. And we didn't think much of it. But I always did hear the Democrats say, like, respond with fear. And I always kind of furrowed my brow because I was like, what's there to be fearful for? We're flying flags, we're smiling, we're having a good time, no one's yelling at anybody. What is there to be fearful of? And for the first time, when I drove through downtown Carson during that protest and there was thousands of protesters, I felt a little bit of fear. And
Hmm.
for the first time, like I got the shoe on the other foot. I got to see it from the other side, and rationally, there's no reason to fear these people. They're
Mm-mm.
peaceably protesting. They're on the sidewalks. They're within their constitutional right. But I still viscerally reacted to it. So I took note of that. And I can kind of, January 6th is seen differently from both sides, polar opposite in a lot of ways. And perhaps from the Democratic side, seeing that put so much fear into them that it's fueled the activities that we see today, where this is like their turn to put the shoe on the other foot and be the aggressors and be the ones who are asserting their voice. And maybe some part of that's therapeutic,
Hmm.
you know?
Well, therapeutic or reaction. I think there are a couple differences though to bear in mind because most of the Trump rallies weren't weren't really out in public. Most of them were ticketed
No,
events, right?
no.
Which is
But
another
January
dynamic,
6th,
huh?
I think January 6th is what I'm
Right.
drawing the direct line from is I think so much fear happened from witnessing that event that there's a direct line between that and the protests we see today. It's like
Yeah.
they desperately want to have their voice heard and they've been disenfranchised in the election and all this. And so you can kind of see how we got here, but I hope it'll be the end of it. Like get it out of your system. Let's get back to like building a decent economy with decent jobs and
Hmm.
get back to a place where we can talk to each other.
Well, and I agree that latter
That
point
last
is
line, yes, that was the
yeah
political. That was being
yeah
political there. Here we go.
no no well no what I meant was the latter point about talking to each other because I think that's what
Yeah.
gets missed in a lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
Look, and again, I've been in Europe for waves of protest.
Yeah.
Um, grew up in the Cold War when, you always kept one eye on the TV, and if the tanks come out, you go pack your stuff and sit in a hotel bar till the Marines can come rescue you, right? And that was the good old days.
I
Um,
don't mean to laugh. This is so
no,
wild.
no, we can laugh about it now, but it is scary at the time.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a constant tension with you know, again, a lot of what I think is going on is we're seeing a shift in a political culture in the U.S. Right, and it's
Yeah.
really not these tactical issues, which party is going to be dominant, although that's part of it. But I think we've got a series of systems that really emerged from the 1930s and 40s that are falling apart globally and domestically,
Sure.
and that's a very uncomfortable time. And the rhetoric we're seeing on both sides um, captures what we've seen before in this. This gets back to this topic: is this the worst of times?
Is
One of
it
the
the
things I
worst of
often used to
times?
teach my undergraduate students is there's a famous depiction of Andrew Jackson's inauguration. Right, Jackson again, first non-notable president. He comes from the West. The Washington elite, right? The early 19th century version of what we might call the swamp. Probably a terminology Jackson would just seize onto with glee. Saw these people who supported Jackson as a bunch of hicks and bumpkins and are just really, really negative as they're watching these people come to DC for the inauguration. And then Jackson throws open the doors to the White House and lets these people into a party and they basically trash the place. It's almost like a frat party that goes wrong, right?
They let steerage into first class?
Oh
What?
well, that's that's an interesting way of putting it. But no, I mean they really do some damage to the White House during this. I mean it's not a civil event, but it becomes one of these things that the people watching it earlier in the day are clearly saying stuff that predisposes them to this narrative when the White House does get trashed. So I I think we're going to see a lot more rough period, but I don't think these protests on either side are necessarily illegitimate. I don't think they're the best approach to solving our problems. We really need to be thinking more deeply about these issues, because frankly, writing something down on a piece of poster board, it doesn't work, right? In my opinion,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
So,
like I said, I always go back to like if you can exercise your constitutional rights, then your country is doing pretty darn good.
mhm,
It's just evident like you have to in order to have rule of law, you have to have all the basics of your society in place. And this is
mhm,
something like we're really trying to develop that center narrative. And this is a good way to talk to people is in order for the rule of law to work and the Constitution to be guaranteed, so much of your country has to be functioning correctly. So, if someone is in fact out exercising their constitutional right to assemble and petition, then by definition, they're doing pretty good in life.
all right,
I mean, you're not showing up to a protest if you're starving. You're not showing up to a protest if you're homeless. You're busy filling your baseline needs. Everyone's needs are met in this country. That is huge. And I think we overlook that because we've been spoiled by our supply chain and our
mhm,
farmers being super innovative and being able to feed so many people. Everyone's made our lives super easy. And I find it ironic that now that we're in the easiest time in human history, people couldn't be more unhappy.
all
So
right,
that's a different conversation. That's a different philosophical thing we could maybe cover sometime. But a good counterpoint to a Democrat at this point is to point out that exercising your constitutional rights is a mark of an excellent life and lifestyle.
right. Yeah, and I think that's very well done, and I would go farther in saying if the ability to organize on a national scale is also sort of a hallmark of having access to information and networks and the time to do it. It really
Yeah.
has been it really is an interesting time, and something we probably want to follow up on and talk to some people.
Yeah.
So again, if you've liked what we've been doing here today, you can see all of our episodes at our website, 775alive.com. We also do the audio podcast and soon going to be doing a video podcast on a range of streaming services. Shout out to Buzzsprout for sort of helping us get into that market as well. If you have any questions, you can email Crystal or I at info@775alive.com.
Yeah, send the questions to Scott. If you have
Oh,
compliments, send them to me.
okay, fair enough. So I'm Scott Gaborski,
And I'm Crystal Newton.
and we'll see you around the 775.